Good evening. As Mark said, I'm Sushi Das and I'm Chief of Staff at RMIT ABC Fact Check. I'll be moderating the discussion tonight about extremism following the Christchurch mosque attacks. We'll talk about how we deal with the threats to Australia's multicultural democracy posed by radical right-wing and Islamist extremism, hate speech and Islamophobia. And we'll also talk about the role the media plays when it comes to reporting terrorism. Hopefully we'll have a stimulating discussion for about half an hour or thereabouts, which should give you plenty of time to think about questions that you might want to ask. And we'll have about half an hour for asking questions at the end. So let me start by introducing our panel. We're very lucky to have three people who have all made a very significant contribution to our understanding of the issues that challenge Australia's multicultural democracy. So starting with Professor Greg Barton. Greg is Professor in Global Islamic Politics at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. He's concerned with Islam, civil society and democratisation, religion and modernity, and with countering violent extremism, with a particular focus on Indonesia, Turkey and Asia. His research interests centre on the way in which religious thought, individual believers and religious communities respond to modernity and to the modern nation state. Ahmed Hassan. Ahmed is a passionate and respected advocate for Melbourne's multicultural community. He works with the government, Victoria Police and industry to highlight the issues faced by disadvantaged youth. He was born in Melbourne to parents from Somalia and Eritrea. And at 18, tender age of 18, he became the co-founder and director of Youth Activating Youth, a not-for-profit organisation that helps young people with education and employment. Tasneem Chopra. You may already be familiar with Tasneem's face. She's been on TV a lot. She's a cross-cultural consultant. Her consultancy addresses issues of leadership, communication, diversity, cultural competence and discrimination. And she's an anti-racism champion for the Australian Human Rights Commission. She's also the chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, and she's a published author, and she's done loads of things. She's been on, ABC's Q&A, The Drama, and lots of other places too. So welcome to you all.
Thank you.
So let's start by reminding ourselves of what happened on March the 15th this year. On that day, an armed 28-year-old man strapped a camera to his forehead and walked into the Al-Nur Mosque in Christchurch, where he gunned down dozens of people who had gathered for Friday prayers. All the while, he live-streamed these killings in a 17-minute video on Facebook. He later attacked people in the Linwood Islamic Centre. In total, he killed 51 people. The oldest was 77 years old, and the youngest was 3. The shooter, who was an Australian citizen, has been charged with murder, and the police recovered 5 firearms, all of which he had a licence for. Before the attacks, he teased what he was going to do on Twitter. He announced it in an online message board on 8chan, and he posted a 74-page manifesto online. After the attacks, the footage was replayed repeatedly on YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit. As the platforms scrambled to take down the clips, new copies popped up to replace them just as fast. This gunman had radical right connections, and he used the tools of the internet as a weapon. By broadcasting his atrocity himself, he was able to circumvent the traditional gatekeepers of news coverage and use online social platforms to publicise the killings and perhaps to try and inspire others to imitate him. Now, this all posed significant challenges for journalists who covered the attack all around the world. Now, we'll get on to how the media's role in all of this, but first, I'd like to start with a look at the broader context. In recent times, we've heard a lot of rhetoric from people like Fraser Anning, who, as you know, mentioned the final solution in the Senate. We've had One Nation. You may recall Pauline Hanson mocking Muslims by wearing a burqa in the Senate. We've heard a lot of divisive commentary from shock jocks and conservative media, not to mention quite a hard line from ministers like Peter Dutton and his claim that people were afraid to go out for dinner because of Sudanese gangs. Can I ask, firstly, do you think these people who are influencers lend any legitimacy to people who buy into the extreme right-wing ideology? Was this attack inevitable, given this kind of rhetoric, not just in Australia, but elsewhere? If I can start with you, Tasneem.
Sure, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, okay. I think it's almost rhetorical. I do believe that, yes, the language and the duplicity of leadership in condoning a state of violence and constant distinctions of us and them has played into it. I think this is obviously the end point, the extreme end point, literally, of where that hate lands. And I don't think it falls squarely. Certainly the Hans Knights and the Fraser Anning supporters are on the far, far right. But I do think we have to acknowledge that in the middle there has been a lot of legitimacy given to vilifying minorities. And whether it has been the number of MPs who signed on to the It's OK to be White motion, who then retracted and then did it again and then retracted, whatever that was. But they clearly, there was a number of them there, and they weren't necessarily the far right, at least in terms of optics, but the behaviour was very much indicative of something that's very problematic, and that sits at the core of who we are. The idea that comments have been loosely made about vilifying the Lebanese community being a problem in this country. Yes, the African gang issue, the idea of wanting to have investigations and inquiries into halal, into certification, into Sharia. This has been an ongoing culture of Islamophobia, for want of a better term, that has sit more and more comfortably in government in a way that makes it very then easy for the proliferation of far-right parties to develop, which we saw at the last election. Something like 20 different groups had used anti-migration, anti-Muslim and xenophobic sentiments as part of their platform. Yeah? So that's clearly become legitimate breeding ground for hate, and we have shown in the language of leadership that it's okay.
That's interesting, Greg, because the shooter, as far as we know, didn't actually mention Fraser Anning or Fraser Anning or Pauline Hanson. He didn't actually mention any of those names, so can we still make that kind of connection?
He made some very clear connections which enable us to sort of, I think, with a reasonable foundation, speculate about that. He most connected with Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist from the July 2011 attacks. We know that in Breivik's very long manifesto, that was 1,500 pages, he referenced mainstream figures, including Australian politicians and prominent American commentators who took an Islamophobic stance, but sort of mainstream. So the fact that the shooter was so consciously referencing Breivik and the ideas coming out of Europe of the great displacement, the idea that migration, particularly Muslim migration, is going to somehow displace us, suggests that it's not drawing a long bow to say that the sort of loose language of what in Australia is not a far-right government, it's a sort of a right-of-centre government that has a crack habit. It's got addicted to the rhetoric of politics of fear. And it's just won an election based not on a set of convincing policies, but on making people afraid of the opposition, which the opposition helped them do. That's another story. So, we don't have our Daggy, that Prime Minister, is not, a right-wing extremist. He's centrist. But he's gotten used to the cheap shots you get from appealing to our fear. And we've got a cabinet now with Peter Dutton and Jason Wood serving alongside him, who have a pretty poor record for inflammatory language. Probably not because they're really that far right themselves, but they find it convenient to use this language. So so this irresponsible behaviour is a question we've got to sort of get at.
Can I just add, Sushi, that even though the terrorist didn't acknowledge Anning in his manifesto, it's interesting that Anning almost understood the terrorist in the comments that he made immediately after, justifying and seeing reason enough to actually then blame Muslims for being complicit in their own murder. So I think they are two sides of the same coin.
Ahmed, there was an incident in Burke Street that you know a fair amount about. I mean, do you think that's all part of the same kind of milieu of this conversation that's going around with Anning and all the rest, and then we see this incident. Can you tell us a little bit about that incident?
Well, that incident was last year, just I think a week before the election. The Burke Street incident, obviously sadly taken, I think 2 lives, 1 life and others injured. And obviously it's not the Islam that we all believe in. And all right, that young person had issues, but to see the Prime Minister come down to Burke Street alongside, the opposition leader, then Matthew Guy, and acknowledge him for his work he's doing to, remove these gangs and starting the talk of how do we cap migration, how do we look into settlement, what is this? And then it went all the way to saying, Islamist extremists, doing this and that. Yes, the young person did a atrocious, act and no one, appreciates him for that, but what was to come was the community's worst fear was, it's one person's act and everyone got hit for it. And you may see 1 or 2 young people doing the wrong thing or 1 or 2 people doing the wrong thing, but the impact that it has is how many young people will get rejected for a interview the next morning that's got, it's got a Tuesday interview, and because we've got an article, we've got an issue here brewing, and you've made it bigger than it seems, people are not educated enough to know and to see beyond the headlines. And that's what I think kind of, upsets us, but makes our work more important in a sense, where you have to continue educating those people about these issues. And the Burke Street issue went on for a while because, there was a state funeral, there was so much to come after that. And personally, dealing with that in those 24 to 48 hours, I knew that it was not going to stop, and everyone wanted to jump on it. So
it felt really politicised, didn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
We know that police resources are finite and threats need to be prioritised. As far as we know, the Christchurch killer had no history of violence and no criminal record, although I think he was deeply entrenched in the global far right. The Muslim community has long asked for the police to focus on potential threats from the extreme right. Do you think, Ahmed, that the police missed the Christchurch killer because they were too focused on Islamists, and the Christchurch killer was like, just a white male from Grafton?
I think I reckon the police services and Australian Federal Police and obviously our security agencies obviously are very well equipped to deal with these issues, but I think there is more of an emphasis on when it's an Islamist person with Muhammad or Ahmed or whoever comes up on the media is more emphasised. It raises a few eyebrows, but when it's for others, it goes untold, or he's just an individual who's just going through some rough time and but the other person, the person who has a Muslim background cannot experience the difficulty. That's the kind of the two-way world we live in, and just to see some of those articles and ways that it comes up, it's just not. It's not what we tend to. It's not balanced media reporting, and for that it costs the community.
Greg, the police have got a bit of a job on their hands, haven't they? Because with the right, there are so many places they can go on the internet to indulge. There's 4chan, 8chan, and all the rest of it, and what's known as shit posting. It must be really hard for the police to sort of get through all of this and know who's being serious, who poses a threat, and who's just getting out of control with their words online. Is that right?
Yeah, that's certainly the case. No one's got a good answer to this. The police weren't looking at social media in general back before the rise of the Islamic State movement. It sort of caught them by surprise that social media would be so important. They are now paying attention to social media. But in the right-wing extremist space, it's really hard to figure out where people are just making empty boasts and using sort of bad humour, or whether there's something deeper and darker. I think what the Christchurch attack points to, and interestingly the Sri Lankan attack as well, is that we had people known to authorities for hateful extremism who overnight became violent extremists. Now, most hateful extremists don't become violent, but we need to pay more attention, I believe, to hateful extremism, to hate incidents, not necessarily hate crimes, because a lot of things are hard to prove as a crime, but even if we just report that somebody has spoken with racist language or very disrespectful fashion. If we started to document that and pay attention to it, we might spot a pattern. We might see in the pattern that things are getting more intense in certain areas or certain individuals, and be alert to the fact that this person may transition from just hatred to actually carrying out an act of terrorism.
And even that would be quite hard, wouldn't it? Because if you're trying to sort of document, I mean, there's so many people on those sites, sort of saying crazy stuff. Would it be a case of just sort of documenting who's saying them and keeping an eye on them?
Yeah, I would suggest we start with, if you sort of spend your life on 8chan and 4chan, it's a pretty large task. But I think we need to pay attention to what goes on in mainstream media and mainstream social media. I think Jacinda Ardern was quite right to say Facebook needs to be more responsible. We're hearing a lot of criticism of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, and I haven't heard anyone make a good defence. I would say in defence of the issue that technically it's very hard to develop algorithms that spot that sort of worrying content. But it is pretty clear that social media, the Facebook empire, Mark Zuckerberg in particular, need to be held to account to back away from the opportunity for profit, which they get profit from traffic, that's the business model, and to tip the balance more on the side of limiting some of that traffic where they see worrying trends. And I think this is an issue that's going to get bigger and bigger. I mean, we can talk about other incidents in the Northern Hemisphere that feed into this, but it's only now that we're beginning to wake up to the problem we've got.
We'll come on to how the media handled this shortly. There is no simple way for the police to tell if someone is just being an angry person on these kinds of sites, or is simply attention seeking or posing a real threat. And like I said, there's so much of this what they call shit posting on the net. As we were discussing earlier, you mentioned that the Anti-Defamation League in the US says that there were 50 deaths in 2018 by right-wing terrorists. And as you know, that in Europe they're having to deal with a significant neo-Nazi element. And in the US, we've got Donald Trump, who's frequently made racist remarks. He's enacted policies against Muslims, and he's courted white nationalists. In Australia, I think there's a feeling sometimes that there is a problem, but it's not that bad here. Do you think Christchurch changed all that, perhaps, Tasneem?
No, I think it did, and it's interesting. People were commenting how in the lead up to the election, this was one of the few elections we've not seen identity politics really come up to the fore, and we've not seen particularly race baiting.
It was all about tax, really, wasn't it?
It was, and I wonder if that is because of the optics of the fact that this terrorist was a blue-eyed, blonde-haired, troubled kid from Grafton.
Do you think that was the case? Is that why it wasn't?
Well, I think when the perpetrator of such a violent and heinous terrorist act looks like society, it's a very confronting mirror to hold to yourself. And so I can see why both sides just said, well, we'll just leave that one alone and we'll get on with the business of tax and whatever the rest of it is that it's going to be, that's not going to.
Some people might think that's a very cynical interpretation.
I am cynical. I don't hide my cynicism, but I think that's a very interesting way things went. Yeah.
Do you think, Ahmed, if the Christchurch attack had been of a different colour and come from a different place, do you think that the two political parties would have made a bigger deal of it in the election
I think it would have been
campaign?
used to some degree, but I did know that there was a lot of talk around the African community and more around migrants generally coming around. I remember that before Christchurch there was that talk of how do we ensure that we have population numbers are capped, how are we ensuring that we don't have this many migrants coming into the country. After Christchurch, all these topics went away slowly, and we started focusing on how do we actually better work together. So if Christchurch didn't happen, a lot of conversations would have came back to migration and immigration, all this stuff where are they settling right, how do we ensure that they settle in the regions. There was all these talks that were coming around, and look, what happened in Christchurch is not something we should do. It's a black day, But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that there's key learnings to be taken away, and we need to ensure that we adapt into our life and continue learning from that day.
Greg, do you think Christchurch has changed the way we look at terrorism?
It's too early to say, but I think that we'll probably look back and see it as a bit of a tipping point.
Yep.
We've had these tipping points before, obviously 9/11, the Bali bombing of 2002. did shift the way we saw things, shifted our perspective, and I think that will be the case with Christchurch. I think, as I said, there's that strange parallel with Sri Lanka in that you had people dismissed as just being troublesome bigots coming out as terrorists, and I think that together will change the way we think about hateful extremism. I think the federal election was its own thing. The politics of fear didn't play well at the Victorian election last year. It's interesting that the Prime Minister locked up what was now most of his cabinet in the back room during the course of the election and said, don't come out until I say it's safe. So we didn't hear from Peter Dutton, and that was a sensible strategy. So the good news is...
For them.
Yeah, for them. They recognised the politics of fear wasn't going to play. And then Bill Shorten ran out in front with a big target, saying, I'm going to tax pensioners. He didn't say that, of course, but that made it easy to construct that fiction. So they drew fire, so they didn't have to go down that rather tricky and dangerous strategy. So in a very cynical way, they got the marketing right, or Morrison got the marketing right, and took a low-risk approach, and Labor, of course, went out with a high-risk approach and suffered as a consequence. And thankfully, we didn't have this allegedly politics dominating our election. Now, maybe had that vote gone differently last year and it was Prime Minister Peter Dutton running to be elected, we would have had a different campaign.
Sorry, Tishy. Just on one point. When we talk about did we think the Christchurch terrorist was what we expected, it's interesting, I think, from the Muslim community standpoint, there was a sense when it did happen, I guess because of the geographic proximity of New Zealand and Australia, it was a horrifying experience to behold, but it wasn't a surprise. And I think overwhelmingly the rise of Islamophobia and hate crimes that have been perpetrated against the diaspora of Muslims in the West is not something that is new. It has been evolving, it has been increasing. And threats against person, against body, against children, against school, I mean, from damage of physical buildings down to threats of rape and murder being acted out upon Australian Muslims in the last 5 to 10 years has come to such a point where we were just waiting for when it was going to be. And I think, so the fact that the optics of this particular terrorist was a blue-haired, blonde-eyed guy wasn't a shock, I think, to many Australian Muslims, but I think for the establishment, they didn't see it coming. And I think it's also telling that the New South Wales hate crime unit had only one staff member for over a year and a half, manning that division. Okay. So what does that tell you about where is the political will to actually address this as a central issue that we know is actually possibly overtaking Islamist terror as the biggest domestic threat?
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's move on to media coverage, which is a topic that everyone has got an opinion on, I'm sure. The Christchurch attacker clearly wanted to broadcast his crimes as widely as possible, and he wanted the media to amplify his act and perhaps, hoping that others might be inspired to do the same. The New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern asked that his name not be broadcast, and many media outlets didn't link to his manifesto. Others eventually took the link down, if they did put it up there. And a lot of mainstream media outlets didn't broadcast the live footage, although they might have shown photos. Now this posed challenges for mainstream media in how they reported the crime. But tech companies, those large tech companies, with social media platforms, were dealing with a slightly different problem. They were trying to take down the live streamed video that was downloaded and then uploaded by millions of people. Tasneem, I'll start with you. What do you think of the way the media handled the Christchurch attacks? Was it acceptable to you how they handled it? I know this is a very big question, so there's lots of different media here, but was it acceptable to you, broadly speaking, or do you think it could have been handled better by the media? Did they make big mistakes?
In retrospect, it's always easy to say that. I think it was a mistake to disseminate those videos, which were graphic, when they did go out.
For you now,
the live streaming of the videos on social media, yes.
Facebook should have done something about it?
Yes, but then, it might have been a Facebook video, but it might have been leveraged then onto the online platform of different media sources. So it is being disseminated by other media, even though the origin was Facebook. So I think there was a missed opportunity to take the moral high ground and say, no, we're not going to do that. I would hope now the lessons from that, as Ahmed said, happened, the lessons from that now are that we don't do that anymore, and live streaming is something that we we look at far more critically and even question ourselves whether we need it.
So it's hard though, isn't it, Greg, because tech companies simply don't have yet the algorithms to take down a video when it's live streamed like that. So when you live stream a video like that, it just goes out instantly. If somebody downloads it and then uploads it as it stands, then algorithms can find it and take it down. But if someone just tweaks that video slightly and then uploads it, much harder for the algorithms to find it. And that's what a lot of them were doing. They were tweaking that video just slightly and then putting it out there. I mean, given what Facebook is facing, is it fair to expect Facebook to come up with an algorithm? I mean, they have devoted, $7-point-something billion to try and research this area. But do you think it's fair for us to say Facebook should have done more earlier?
I think it's fair to say Facebook and the others have to try harder. We accept that it's a hard thing to do. They've done good work on other sorts of offensive material, child exploitation material, whatever. People who work in this area say it's easier technically to have algorithms detecting that material. Nevertheless, when pushed, they've had to lift their game in the past. I think they really need to be pushed very hard now. Nothing about what Mark Zuckerberg says of his company suggests that he's really got to the point, the tipping point yet, where he's realising he has no choice. They're just sort of pushing back. And we have this curious thing where he fronts before Congress or Parliament, and the audience who are fairly learned, nevertheless are bamboozled and don't understand the issues, don't know how to push back, and in that confusion, Facebook just sort of soldiers on. The Europeans are doing better at pushing back than the others, but I think we have to sort of ask for more transparency. Facebook is by no means the worst. Instagram is much more opaque, and it's now very much dominated in the sort of the chat space with right-wing extremism, and nothing's been done so far. So we need to really start paying attention. So
the right-wing extremists are sort of coming onto Instagram?
Yes.
Okay. And what do they do? Post pictures, do they? And
Look, there's a really nice essay in the Atlantic Monthly, I think 6 weeks ago. It's not too hard to find, and it points out that the way, let's say, people of our generation, not your generation, Ahmed, use Instagram is kind of innocent and naive. We post holiday snaps and share with our friends. A younger generation, which is your generation, Ahmed, who are tech-savvy and switched onto these things, use it as a platform for communicating and viral dissemination. And so that's gone very big on Instagram. And whereas there's some degree of transparency with the way Twitter algorithms work, and Facebook is increasingly forced to be transparent, there's no transparency with Instagram.
Wow, that's really interesting. I know we're going to move on to questions pretty soon, but not before I want to ask one more question, if I may. We've often seen that with lone actor attacks, whether it's, as you mentioned the other day, the truck driver in Paris who drove his van into people on Bastille Day, or whether we're talking about Manhattan Monis in Sydney, they have a history of misogyny or domestic violence. We don't know if that was the case with the Christchurch killer, but you've noted, Greg, that there are similarities between the Islamists who buy into a deeply patriarchal system and then men from the radical right. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
We talk about radicalisation, but radicalisation is really more about recruitment. So the idea of somebody self-radicalising is pretty rare in practice. People fall in with a group of friends. Now, they might go in initially with very extreme ideas and sort of bigoted views, but often you get young people who are just drawn into bad company, as happens in other areas of life, and then they internalise the ideas. But one of the sort of principal methods used by those who would recruit is to say, look, the problems you're facing as a person are not your personal failings. They're the result of a system which is wrong and is against you. So if you come and join us, we'll fight against this system. Now, for Islamic State, it's a kind of revolutionary Marxist idea, basically. Let's change the system by precipitating a revolution and put a new system in place, and then magically that'll make everything right, which we know they haven't delivered on. The right-wing extremists have the same thing. They say, look, we've got to change this broken system, so they're very deeply cynical of big government. They don't really explain what they've put in its place. But even the outlier of the right-wing extremist movement, the so-called incel, involved with the Toronto van attack, for example, it's the same idea that I'm suffering I'm a victim of a system that's wrong. And in this case, it's the links with a misogynist patriarchy even more clear, because their particular beef is that women aren't attracted to them, which is a mystery. But anyway, but running through all of this is this self-justification, which is put in very toxic masculine terms, that says the world is wrong and it needs to go back to some imaginary past where it was right, or we can take it back to a caliphate or a proper system of government. And one of the things that's gone wrong is women have lost their place and they're challenging us. So the right-wing extremist stuff is full of all this sort of nasty, if only women went back to the kitchen and knew their place, then the world would be right. But now they're out and they're a trouble to themselves and they're a trouble to us, and we've got to put them back in place. And so they justify what's very blatant misogyny by saying, well, it's done in a sort of a jocular fashion, but by saying this is what has to happen. And Islamic State is less humorous, but the same sort of idea. It's not good for anyone to have this feminist revolution where women are set free without any moorings. It's not good for them, so we'll put it back and make it safe. And perversely, a lot of young women were attracted to Islamic State, coming often out of households where they didn't have much freedom, and they saw freedom in rebelling, but into exactly the wrong area that was against their interests. But so we need to better understand the social dynamic of attracting people and recruiting them, and the way in which these essentially toxic masculine ideas play into the message, this common human desire, not just for company and acceptance, but also for feeling self-pity and blaming somebody else for our problems.
Ahmed, you deal with a lot of young men. Does any of this, can you see any of this in the young men today? Is there a feeling that are they moving towards more respectful position with women, or do you see any misogyny coming through with particularly those people who might be on the far side, the extreme sides of things?
Well, we deal with a lot of young people, and obviously there's young people who obviously take radical agendas. There's young people who have obviously different issues, but a lot of the young people that you deal with have a lot of, it's deep-rooted issues, which obviously can come from from settlement, from family, from it's what they see at home that they adapt to. So if they see that they come from a home where the father's respectful to the mother, then they're more likely to have that respect and carry that respectful relationship with others they deal with day to day. When it's the other way around, and it differs with every family, but with a lot of the young people, and since we're talking about extremism, and Greg Barton's here obviously and he can testify to this, but I'd like to talk about the vulnerability of these young people. These young people that are feeling vulnerable, these young people that are feeling hopeless, like in a sense where they don't have anything to look forward to the next day, and where they see Islamic State, or you see whatever's happening in foreign countries as like kind of an interest area is what kind of scares me. And these young people need to be, I know there's a lot of work being done in the de-radicalisation with a lot of programs being rolled out in key areas, and where we've seen a lot of young people facing issues. But what we need to look at is how do we look at these young people before they attempt something, or before they carry out an act, and how do we ensure that they are we get to them before they get to this stage. And we need to ensure that we are giving them opportunities in employment, we are giving them opportunities at school. We know that every child that comes to this classroom is a young person that wants to participate in this thing. He's got a respectful relationship for the country that he lives in. All these things are things that lead up to this, and then they start growing up, and then we say, oh, who's turned that into an extremist, who's carried out, who's killed out 3 people in the city. And we've got to look at what to do before, 3, 4, 5 years, 6 years before.
Yeah. Okay. I could keep on asking questions. I know that we can't talk about Christchurch without also talking about the way Jacinda Ardern handled it afterwards. She was lauded all around the world for her empathy, the speed with which she acted, and the amendment of the gun laws in New Zealand, and her general ability to just lower the temperature. It would be interesting to know how come she was able to do that, and other leaders around the world haven't ended up handling things in the same way. But I won't pose that question myself. Maybe one of you might like to.
She's not a man.
I know. So I'm thinking there's some sort of a link here. But perhaps I might throw to the audience now for questions. I'm sure you've all got plenty to say. Before we start, could I just gently ask you to perhaps ask the panelists questions rather than statements, because it makes it easier for the panelists to respond. You've got a mic there.
Can I just request those asking questions just to bring it closer to yourselves? Just so.
Thank you. Hello everyone, my name's Natalie Ralph. I'm based at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University. So my question is, can you tell me please if you know of any examples or writings that I could look at which discuss the business role in countering or preventing violent extremism or stroke promoting social cohesion and resilience. And when I say business role, I do tend to approach this in a very general fashion, both mom and dad businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises, social enterprise, or big corporations. So I open that up to you. What I've noticed is that generally in the literature, there's a discussion around social enterprise, of course, you know. So, but can you give me any other examples or say who you might know that works on this? And of course, media, etc., is a business as well. So that is one example.
Tasneem, would you like to attempt that one?
I can't think of any business models that come to mind off the top of my head, but it's funny bringing that up and the role of community in working with people who are on the fringes, I think is an interesting way to go. And both Greg and Ahmed have both alluded to the fact that for a lot of the young people that might be falling at the fringes of not belonging, who end up with either the right wing or Islamist, potentially those kind of groups, that ability to not belong and not fit in is a much broader issue than a business plan, a business proposal was going to fix. And I think that inability to belong comes down to society not wanting you, not feeling that society doesn't value you. And it's sort of a cyclical issue, because as long as leadership is going to vilify minorities who look different, sound different, believe different, that you don't fit in, your values will never align with ours, how do young people feel they're ever going to fit in if that's the kind of mantra they're constantly being fed? And when you feel like the state doesn't think you belong, and you are rejected from job opportunities, you are racially profiled by police, you're having a hard time at school, then you are going to develop this subculture mentality, well, if nobody wants me, I'll hang out with so-and-so. So I think for me the solution is actually investing in communities. Investing in communities to support those young people who are feeling marginalised, but doing that in tandem with changing the kind of rhetoric that we're using when we talk about difference and when we talk about minorities. I mean, if you're just going to fund a social integration program but continue to be racist in your policy, it's really a futile solution. So it takes funding, but it also takes responsible leadership, so that when young people feel like they belong, they see that reflected in the language of their leaders around them, and then we can talk about business proposals.
But there are opportunities for businesses, because these days they do like to associate themselves with worthy causes, don't they? And you can see opportunities where businesses could get involved, couldn't you?
Absolutely. A lot of business, actually, I'll give you an example. And, you know, post all this African gang narrative, a lot of businesses were in touch with the community. How can we employ your young people? How can we ensure that we open up our TAFEs, our schooling systems, our institutes? You know, and you could see a lot of people who had zero understanding in getting involved. And I remember people using, you know, coarse language where you think that you should not be acceptable, but they didn't know nothing beyond the headlines. And when I say this, I mean it. And they say, oh, isn't Africa one country? You know, it's just, you get these kind of people that you have to deal with. But what we've seen is when you've been able to establish a relationship, especially a working relationship that leads to an outcome, we've seen that they feel more invested. They feel like they want to do this after hours, after their job is done. They want to take on young people. So there is an opportunity for business to play its role. And I'll obviously say this around my work and my daily goal is obviously to bring in government, community and business, because if we could bring that cycle, I reckon a lot of the issues could be fixed.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm also from Alfred Deakin Institute, Deakin University. I'm a PhD student. My question is towards Greg. Thank you, Greg, for your insights. I can't stop comparing the two, political Islam and far right and white supremacist ideologies. For me, I find them to be the same. However, policing those two seems to be very dramatically different. And you were saying that recruiting happens when a person is driven to join a group on the assumption that this group will fix the problems. Now, this is how Daesh or ISIS has recruited their people. However, the perpetrator at Christchurch was a solo person who was recruited by hate, by ideologies that were floating all around the West and Austria, Europe. Trump said many of the things that this person quoted. And so it's an ideology. It's not a group. It's an ideology that has been mainstreamed, accepted, and the jokes that floats around on Facebook, it has been accepted. They're not being policed in the same manner and in the same way, sorry, that Muslims communities in the West has been policed for so long. Raids would take place in houses of Muslims for posts, if they post something that's not within the accepted narrative of what the police would think that is acceptable. Their houses would be raided. So why isn't it the same? Why isn't the policing of these discourses and these ideologies take the same shape if they can lead to the same consequences like atrocities?
I'll try and avoid giving a long answer because the question deserves a long answer, but I won't use that as a justification for taking too much time. But it's a good question, and then there's lots of dimensions to the question. Look, I think, in a positive sense, ignorance, not understanding things contributes to the problems we have. In a more direct negative sense, racism that plays a role. In defence of Australian police, and they certainly make mistakes, state and federal, but they have been warning us about right-wing extremism for a long time and saying it's not a question of if but when. So if they weren't surprised by Christchurch, they can't allocate resources too far ahead of where the immediate demand is, but they were increasingly paying attention to this. Having said that, if you look at North America, and you can see the influence of politics here, when Trump became president, he immediately stopped all funding for countering violent extremism programs dealing with right-wing extremism, said it's not a problem, and then used rhetoric for his own purposes, which gave the right-wing extremists a sense of license. And of course, famously after Charlottesville said, well, there's very fine people on all sides, so never backed away from these things. So there's a problem there with his brand of politics, which probably isn't particularly disciplined in terms of ideas, but is self-serving, and the licensing space. But it compounds with another problem that American police and prosecutors face, in that they have never legislated so that domestic terrorism can be easily prosecuted as terrorism. Terrorism in America is prosecuted as terrorism when you're part of an international prescribed group, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, or whatever. And so even though they acknowledge they've got a problem with domestic terrorism, and the ADL report from last year said at least conservatively 50 deaths due to terrorism and at least 48 right-wing extremists. So it's the biggest problem, has been the biggest problem in America, even if you go back right to 9/11 and all the time. Yeah, Oakland, of course, in 95 before that, but even with the surge of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, still right-wing extremism is the biggest terrorism problem in America. A lot of people understand it, a lot of police understand it, but they have trouble because of the way legislation is framed in getting the attention. If somebody's not reported in the media as having been charged with terrorism because it didn't happen, they were charged with gun possession, mass murder, whatever, then that shifts our perception. So that's a problem in America. I don't think the mistakes made towards securitizing Muslim communities and overreacting, mistakes you want to see repeated in those communities or anywhere else. So there's it's not a question of police kicking down doors needlessly and just interrupting when somebody's saying something that is worrying. But we need to, the reminder is we need to better understand where this shift happening between hateful extremism going beyond a threshold where there's incitement of hatred, but then it becomes a matter that the state really should intervene in. Interestingly, in Sri Lanka, the Muslim communities were reporting to authorities repeatedly saying, we're really worried about this group on the east coast. We think they're really nasty and they're dangerous. And the government didn't want to know about it, wasn't paying attention. So I think these cases make us realise that we can't just, and we don't want to police thought, but we do need to recognise if people are openly inciting hatred and contributing to open discrimination and oppression of whichever community, then that needs to be called to account. And I don't think we've seen that done sufficiently with the right-wing extremism. And part of the problem is because even politicians who are not themselves that far right, we mentioned Morrison. Think of Walid Ali's piece to camera on the project on the Friday after the Friday evening, hours after the Christchurch attack, and then his interview with Scott Morrison, who probably only came into the studio because Walid had already been to Wellington and spoken to Jacinda Ardern at her invitation. Morrison didn't perform very well, at least in the second half of the interview, because he was so self-defensive. Now, his views aren't that extreme, but there was no mea culpa, there was no acknowledgement that maybe he'd been loose with his rhetoric and that the lessons learned. And I think that covers up the space for addressing these things. So I'm disappointed to see Peter Dutton now back with Jason Wood as his Robin to Dutton's Batman. I don't think that's going to bring out the best response, but I think I still hope for this government that they'll start to do a stock take and say, well, we've got to pay attention to this language, and then we need to say to state and federal police, yes, your bias crimes units or your hate register needs to be taken seriously and needs to be properly funded and needs to be properly supported. I think we need to end up with perhaps at a state level first, but eventually a national hate crimes and hate incidents register so we can see what's going on, and then we'll perhaps start to see where the problems are, and then we'll start to get some sort of reasonable balance in the way we frame things.
Hi, I'm Harold Swire. I'm a board member of the Jewish, Christian and Muslim Association. Clearly the right-wing extremism, as all extremism, isn't the issue. There's a background issue that's nurtured it in the first place, and people have already referred to the need to nurture community. I'm just interested to know what you think about the relationship between government and this idea of nurturing community, because really community is something that's very close to you and the people who you associate with, and governments aren't really good at nurturing that sort of thing. They've got other things that they tend to be involved with. I wonder what you think the role of government can be in trying to nurture community. What sort of role would they take in it?
Ahmed, would you like to attempt that one?
I reckon there's been relationships between government and people. Obviously, community is sometimes fragile, but what needs to be done in this thing and nurturing the community is to build the capacity of these communities so that they've got the right resources and funds to assist their communities. I think for far too long I reckon other people work on behalf of communities. So you say, I can come back to the African community where it's being serviced by a non-African community organisation where the community itself's capacity hasn't been built. And that's, I reckon, with the Muslim communities, it's quite the same. And I think it's getting a little bit better now. There's been a bit of funds being given to ensure that happens, because obviously they've got, psychologists, people who have got professional backgrounds coming together and forming an organisation or a service that they can actually give back to the community. But I think at the end, you want the community to help themselves. You want them to have the right skills and capacity at their disposal so that they can assist the upcoming generations, so that we don't have an issue of going back to government, rather being self-sufficient as a community.
Hi, Hi, I'm Sibylla. I'm at Monash University, and I'm actually doing a research project on incels and terrorism. So this is directed at Greg. I also incidentally work for the Press Club. But you mentioned that toxic masculinity and the patriarchy has a big role to play in terrorism across the board. Why aren't we taking misogyny or dangerous misogyny into account in terms of countering radicalisation, especially given that some people have described misogyny and misogynistic views as sort of a gateway, particularly into right-wing terrorism?
Look, there have been researchers looking at this for a long time, so it's not that no one's done it, but it's still an emerging area. Mia Bloom has a new book called Small Arms, which looks at women and children in terrorist organisations. And Mia's done a lot of work on this for a long time, but she's sort of a pioneer. I think, we don't know what we don't know, so because we haven't looked at these issues directly, we haven't sort of recognised how important they are. It has to be said, the elephant in the room is that, for all of our anxiety about terrorism, what is it, so far 2019, 24 women killed, domestic violence, intimate partners generally, not strangers, sometimes strangers, but most often, unfortunately, partners, former partners. And that's such a big problem that almost seems to disappear because we're so close to it, we don't see it. And I think we need to, if we start to take these things more seriously, then it will help us do everything better. It's significant when it comes to the Lynn Cafe siege that there wasn't, and this was a legislation problem, but there wasn't sharing information between people dealing with different aspects of Monis's life. Being on the case against the death of the murder of his former wife, but the information wasn't required to be shared. With the Brighton siege event, had the authorities shared information from parole board and other concerns, the fact that the individual had previously been arrested, Operation Neath, then the case didn't proceed because of evidentiary problems, then probably he might have, the situation may have been saved because that information together would have been enough to trigger some response. And certainly with Morris it seems that probably he wouldn't have been able to carry out the attack if that information had been shared. So I think sharing information, paying attention to domestic violence, sharing information about cases that come up before family court or domestic violence incidents and putting it into a larger pool. I know we have respect for privacy and that sort of binds us, but that would help us have clearer vision and taking these things more seriously.
Can I segue into Jacinda Ardern and then sneak in my own question here? What was it about the way she handled it, Christchurch, that was so different to the way other leaders have handled it? And why aren't other leaders doing it like she did? Is it because she was a woman?
It's because she is a good woman. I mean, not just she's a woman. I mean, I'm sure that, I don't know how many of you have lost sleep thinking about the fate of Theresa May, but you might reflect on her career as in the Home Office. She didn't cover herself in glory, so it's not just a question of gender. I think what happened with Jacinda Ardern is that she came across as very authentic, not because she was trying to be authentic, because she was authentic. And she was deeply moved, and she spoke in the first instance in my interpretation, as a New Zealander, as a Kiwi, and the head Kiwi, the first Kiwi, if you like, because that was her role as Prime Minister. But it wasn't with the Prime Ministerial hat in a political role. It was as somebody representing her community, and she defined the community as everyone. She said, "You all are us. You came to us, and you were all us." And she had, it was exactly right. I mean,
and I think it comes back to the point the gentleman made earlier about the distinction between government and communities. I think in that particular instance, Jacinda, she really indicated she was a New Zealander from the community, even though she was speaking as government. So that informed her authenticity. And instead of reacting with aggression, she reacted with compassion and just being practical, looking at the practicalities of what needed to be done before posturing about, we need to be retaliatory, we need to get aggressive. So when you look at incidences in the past where Western nations have been affronted by terror attacks, the playbook has always been, we're going to invade, there's going to be an incursion, she took a very different approach. Largely because obviously the terrorist was an Australian, she wasn't going to attack Australia, but her attitude wasn't one of vengeance, it was one of, we need to deal with the pain. And so she led with strength and she led with compassion. And I think those are qualities we don't ascribe to leadership when we should. And I just want to throw in Egg Boy today, the boy who threw the egg on Fraser Anning. He raised $99,960 in his GoFundMe account, which he raised it from people who were donating to his legal funds. Now, his lawyer did the whole case pro bono. He wasn't charged. And he had this $100,000, which he's donated back to the Christchurch families and victims. And I thought, that's leadership. That's showing compassion. He got nothing out of it himself, but he said, and I think his exact words were, "They need this more than I do." And I'm thinking, we don't see that level of compassion anywhere near it from our leaders in this country.
Yeah, I think the key things were lack of aggression and empathy and compassion.
Well, it needs to be borne in mind that the key mechanism of terrorism is, why do terrorists do outrageous things? Because they want us to be angry, they want us to be outraged. 9/11 was proved that $500,000 in flight school and other costs, and trillions and trillions of dollars. Last track, it was $6 trillion in American federal funding, but and 500,000 lives directly lost. So not responding to provocation is the first thing to do with terrorism. It's going back to the media theme. We need to sort of frame it in terms of, okay, what are these people? They're trying to push our buttons. How do they want us to respond? Let's not give them what they want. Let's not name him and make him a hero, and let's not get angry because that's what they want.
The headlines also matter.
Yes, yeah.
Very important.
I'm mindful of time, but how about we just take... how about we just take one more question?
I have the microphone, so I'll yeah. Thanks.
Maybe we'll take two and then... okay.
Thanks, Sushi. I'm David Polton. I'm a lawyer, and I just wanted to ask a bit of a law reform question. I think probably our theme really for all of this is, if I can suggest a generalisation, is really promoting and preserving and protecting a harmonious multicultural society. That's what we're really talking about. And I think the one area perhaps that did get a bit of a run in the election campaign, apart from tax, in this kind of area, sort of came up in a slightly trivial way about whether a sportsman is entitled to tweet about the afterlife destination of certain groups. But that provoked a sort of discussion about whether we needed changes to preserve or to protect religious freedom, was the way it was characterised. I wonder if any of the panel think that the current laws are inadequate to protect religious freedom, if there should be changes, and how they would help if there is something that can be positively achieved out of that based on what the political dialogue was at the election.
Greg, would you like to take that?
You go.
I'll start off because I'm sure others. Look, I think, just to be clear, I think that the response to Isaac Fallau's indiscretion, which was not the first time, and he was counselled and he knew what he was doing, and he did something very wrong. I think the response was an overreaction. I think it's counterproductive. I don't think it helps the cause. I do think in terms of legal reform, we need to sharpen our thinking about what constitutes hate crime, but also hate incidents, and to think about where we go from just having radical or extreme ideas to having hateful extremist ideas, and draw that boundary in legal terms, not necessarily to prosecute, but to make it clear where this is beyond the pale, and then to call people out. I think the issue that didn't come out clearly enough in the Isaac Fallau case is that we know that youth suicide for young people particularly, who are struggling with sexual orientation issues, is dramatically higher. Like I forget the figure, but I think 4 times higher for teenage people who are same-sex attracted than it is for, or struggling with questions of sexual orientation than it is for straight kids. So it's a practical problem. So when you're a high-profile sportsman, what you do is important, and I think it needs to be called out when you've done something that has consequences beyond what you recognise. But I do think breaking the contract was probably going to be counterproductive. Going back to Natalie's first question, I think what the AFL has been doing has been, they make mistakes, sure, but they're doing good work. One area of industry in Australia where there's real leadership being shown is across the sporting field. It's many, many cases of that. And it's a work in progress, but we're trying to figure out what's acceptable, how we model behaviour, and what behaviour is not acceptable. And then for people who, for whatever reason, are role models, if they're prominent athletes in this case, then they have to be called to a higher standard because they are playing this public role as well as a sporting career.
Just really quickly, I think the racial and religious vilification laws in Victoria are good. I don't think we should be weakening 18C in any way, if anything, strengthening it. That's my personal view. That said, freedom of speech doesn't come with freedom of consequence. So I think in the case of Israel Folau, Greg alluded to the fact that there are consequences for that which we need to be mindful of, and so they should be.
Yep. Hi. Look, my question around media responsibility, and we touched by social media, but just the general media, for example, day after what happened in Christchurch, I saw an article in The Age which had a Jacinda photo, but the article actual content was anti-migration, written by Amanda Weinstein. So things like that. And also my point around the Islamic, just want to understand why Australian media is not following pursuit of the international media in Middle East, where they don't refuse to call ISIS an Islamic State, they call them Daesh. And I think we're around the perception of, Muslims and Islamic, we're using all these terms, but if you see the Islamic State, Daesh, 99% of people they've killed are Muslims. They're the one who are blowing up mosques. I'm from Afghanistan. Just recently, they blow up masjid a few days ago, where the Grand Imam of Kabul was dead, and then the next day they blow up his grave. So I don't know why we're not linking international politics with this group rather than more of a religion. And I think it's how we hold responsible the media, especially journalists who pursue is to, because they want to be famous and they want to get writing on their articles, they tend to write articles more around Islamic words, Muslim words, and things like that. So how can we hold more responsible the media, especially if they're not following, ethical standards?
Yeah. How are you holding responsible and educating everyone that you said? I'll just perhaps respond to one aspect of that. If you saw an article written by Amanda Vanstone in The Age, then almost certainly that would have been an opinion article, which would have appeared on the opinion pages, which is actually quite separate to the reportage in the paper. And I think we have to be mindful when we're reading opinion and when we're reading reportage. So I just wanted to point that out first.
Ordinary Australian would not know the difference. It's just a paper saying The Age, the Fairfax, and it's the article.
Yes, I think The Age does clearly mark opinion articles as opinion. I'm pretty sure about that.
Just to, I don't want to drag on The Age. I like The Age. They actually called up and actually reported, and then that photo was down the next time. But it was still appeared online, but I think it was done on the store.
Okay, I might let the panel deal with the rest of your question. Why do we call them ISIS and not Daesh? Yeah.
Professor,
Great.
you say use the word Khilafat, and you know Daesh has a political agenda, and you know in terms of you're a well-educated man, and you know what's going on in Syria, who's funding them, how they've been, where they're getting their weapons from, who they're fighting. And still here, we're here, trying to change people's perception, but we're still using the Islamic acronyms. And that's ordinary Australians, when they look at Khilafah, they look at Muslim, they look at Sharia, they look at Halal tax, they see ordinary Muslim like me, somebody else with a scarf, as in we came from the same camp. But in fact, we are the ones who are fighting. We're the ones. No, non-Australian army is fighting ISIS. It's Muslims army in Iraq, in Syria, that are fighting this Daesh.
Who would like to handle that?
Well, let me. You make a very good point, and look, it's one of the challenges with the media space is communicating effectively and clearly and succinctly, which we're not perhaps doing. I'm not doing such a good job tonight, but we should be saying the so-called Islamic State, which I think the BBC took that turn of phrase. Look, Daesh, you know where Daesh comes from, the acronym, Dar al-Islam, it just means Islamic State, so that's not a solution. It might be slightly better to say Daesh than Islamic State, but we should be framing it as the group that claims to be an Islamic State, the so-called caliphate. It's kind of tiresome to always say the so-called, so we don't always do it, but you're right, we need to frame it. Most of their victims are fellow Sunni Muslims. What they do is a absurd caricature of religion, using some religious words in a way that mainstream religious leaders and communities don't recognise. So I accept all of that. To try and be quick, I think Sushi's point is very important. I don't think myself, engaging with Australian media or international media over, well, a very long time on these issues, that the media is the problem. I think, in fact, reporting is getting better. The problem is the commentariat, which actually includes me, but certainly includes Andrew Bolt and the rest of the regular columnists and the people who have essays in the opinion pages. That's where things get really weird. So even in News Corp, you'll find really good reporting and good analysis. The stuff that really makes your blood boil is your, half a dozen or so regular columnists who seem to be playing almost a kind of a caricature of themselves as a kind of business model. And then when Amanda Vanstone, to be fair, is generally fairly sensible, but you get people weighing in sometimes out of their depth for things they don't understand and they're making mistakes, but they're not journalists. But I agree that the Australian public doesn't see the distinction. It's in the paper, it's on television. Yeah,
I think education goes a long way in education of media professionals, education of editors as well, in understanding what the accuracies are, and that would certainly help. But I think the other issue that you raised is that if Amanda Vanstone has an inflammatory opinion piece in the paper, is there a counter platform which there could be another article written to? So seek that out. Seek out opportunities to counteract those statements with your own pieces. And that's what I say. We need more diverse representation in media spaces of communities who are constantly written about, but never themselves having the chance to write. So I think that's a very good way of countering that. So yeah, take your agitation and move it into a productive written piece. That would be good.
That's good advice. Write a piece and send it to the Age. Okay, we could carry on talking about this topic for a very long time, I'm sure, but I'm mindful that our time is up. So I'd like to thank the panel who have provided us with lots to think about. To all three of you, your work in this area is hugely valued, and we're very grateful for your contribution tonight, so thank you very much for that. I'd also like to thank you, the audience. You've posed some excellent and stimulating questions to the panel, and thank you for coming on this rather frosty and rainy and windy night to be part of a very warm and engaging evening. And finally, I would like to thank the Melbourne Press Club and the Australian Intercultural Society for hosting this dinner and discussion tonight. Long may your inspirational collaboration continue. Thank you.